The sun over the high plains was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the weathered souls of Redemption Gap. It was a town that had long ago traded its virtue for survival, a place where corruption wore a sheriff's badge and justice was sold to the highest bidder. On the outskirts of this moral decay, nestled in a small fertile valley, lived Paul. At 30, Paul looked like a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, his movements were economical and deliberate, whether he was mending a fence or drawing the Colt peacemaker that rested comfortably on his thigh. His face was a mask of stoic masculinity, tanned and lined by the sun, but his eyes, a deep, quiet gray, held a sorrow that the sun could not touch. It was the ghost of a memory, of a wife's last breath and a child's first and only cry, both lost in the bloody crucible of childbirth 5 years prior. That day something in Paul had broken, and he had retreated into a fortress of solitude. His farm was his sanctuary. He worked the land with a relentless energy, coaxing life from the soil, as if to defy the death that haunted him. He spoke little, lived simply, and kept the world at arm's length. Yet he was not entirely a hermit. The roads around Redemption Gap were plagued by bandits who preyed on farmers hauling their meager harvests to market. For a modest fee, Paul offered protection. He was a silent, lethal shadow, his reputation alone often enough to deter the jackals. He was a gunfighter who grew his own food, a paradox the local farmers were grateful for. His only other concession to the outside world was the town church. It wasn't piety that drew him, but a gnawing sense of inadequacy. He sought out Father Michael, a kind, elderly man whose wisdom was one of the few, untarnished things in town. "I want to learn to read," Paul had confessed one afternoon, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. He had never needed words, only the sharp crack of his rifle and the silent language of the land. But in the long, quiet nights, the silence had grown too loud, and he felt a desperate need to understand the book his wife had cherished, her Bible. Father Michael had smiled gently. "Knowledge is a worthy pursuit, my son, but my eyes are not what they once were." He gestured across the nave where a young woman was carefully dusting the pews. "Esther, however, she has the sharpest mind and the kindest heart in this town. Perhaps she would be willing to guide you." Esther was 22, with intelligent, clear blue eyes and a quiet confidence that set her apart. She carried herself with a straight-back grace, her devout nature a source of both solace for her and suspicion for the superstitious townsfolk. She was an orphan, raised by the church, and her world was one of books and prayer. When Paul approached her, she was not intimidated by his formidable presence. She saw past the gun and the silence to the raw yearning in his eyes. "The Lord's words are for all his children," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It would be my honor to share them with you." And so began their lessons. Twice a week in the quiet of the church, they would sit together, the large leather-bound Bible open between them. Her slender finger would trace the lines of scripture, and his deep voice would stumble, then grow steady, as he sounded out the ancient words. He was a surprisingly quick study. The same focus he applied to tracking a deer or sighting a target, he now applied to the alphabet. A bond formed between them, woven from shared psalms and quiet understanding. He spoke of his farm, of the rhythm of the seasons. She spoke of her faith, of the comfort she found in the unwavering logic of Scripture. He found himself looking forward to their sessions, to the sound of her voice and the patient way she would correct his mistakes. She, in turn, found a deep well of gentleness beneath his rugged exterior. She saw the way his large, calloused hands handled the delicate pages of the Bible, with reverence, and she knew he was a good man. It was Esther's sharp mind and innate sense of justice that led her to uncover the darkness festering at the heart of Redemption Gap. An elderly farmer, Mr. Abernathy, had come to her in tears, clutching a foreclosure notice signed by Sheriff Miller. The notice claimed he was delinquent on a loan he swore he had paid off. His deed, he said, was held by the town's most prosperous businessman, Mr. Bartholomew Caldwell. Caldwell was a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He owned the saloon, the general store, and half the land in the county. He was a close friend to the sheriff and Judge Hemlock, forming an unholy trinity that ruled the town. Intrigued and angered by the farmer's plight, Esther offered to look at the town's land registry. The records, kept in a dusty back room at the sheriff's office, were a chaotic mess of smudged ink and missing pages. But Esther was meticulous. For days, she cross-referenced deeds, tax payments, and loan agreements. Slowly, a sinister pattern emerged. She discovered a second hidden ledger, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard. It was Caldwell's secret account book, detailing a systematic scheme of embezzlement. He was falsifying records, buying up debt for pennies on the dollar, and foreclosing on innocent farmers, with the full cooperation of the sheriff and the judge. Armed with irrefutable proof, Esther's sense of righteousness burned hot. She didn't go to Paul. This was a battle of ledgers and laws, not guns. She requested a town meeting, standing before Caldwell, Sheriff Miller, and Judge Hemlock, her evidence laid out on a table for all to see. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice ringing with conviction, "these records show that you have been systematically defrauding the people of this community. You have stolen land and property through deceit and forgery." A stunned silence fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Caldwell's face, usually a mask of smug affability, darkened into a thunderous scowl. "These are outrageous and baseless accusations from a fanciful girl who spends too much time with dusty books," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "They are not accusations, sir. They are facts," Esther countered, her gaze unwavering. "I propose a solution. Allow me to manage the town's land registry. I will create a clear, transparent system where every transaction is recorded publicly. It will protect the farmers and ensure that no one can be cheated again." Her courage was a torch thrown into a powder keg. The farmers murmured in agreement, their hope ignited. But Caldwell and his cronies saw only a threat to their empire. That night, the three men met in the back room of Caldwell's saloon. "She's a menace," Sheriff Miller, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt, grumbled. "She'll turn the whole town against us." "Then we must turn the town against her first," Caldwell said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He poured 3 glasses of whiskey. "These people are simple. They're superstitious. They fear what they don't understand, and they certainly don't understand a woman who reads and thinks like a man." He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "We won't accuse her of fraud. We'll accuse her of something far older, far more potent. We'll brand her a witch." The plan was as simple as it was vicious. The next day, one of Caldwell's thugs snuck into the small room Esther occupied at the back of the church and planted a book, a cheap storybook filled with lurid tales of witches, dark spells, and pacts with the devil. The rumor started as a whisper in the saloon and spread like a plague. "Did you hear? She talks to spirits. They say she uses her books to cast spells. Abernathy's prize bull died last night. She must have cursed it." Caldwell fanned the flames, offering free drinks to anyone with a story to tell. The planted book was discovered by the sheriff, who displayed it in the town square as undeniable proof. The townsfolk, steeped in ignorance and fear, turned on Esther with terrifying speed. The woman who had tried to save them was now the source of all their troubles. Her intelligence was twisted into cunning, her piety into a devilish disguise. A mob, their faces contorted with self-righteous fury, descended on the church, dragging her out into the street. A hasty trial was convened, with Judge Hemlock presiding. It was a farce. Esther's calm, logical denials were drowned out by the shouts of "witch" and "burn her." She was sentenced to hang at dawn. Miles away, Paul was guiding 3 wagons loaded with grain through a treacherous canyon. He had done this run a dozen times, but this time a cold dread settled in his gut. It was an irrational, primal feeling, a whisper on the wind that something was terribly wrong back in Redemption Gap. He kept seeing Esther's face in his mind, her clear blue eyes, the way she smiled when he finally read a difficult passage without stumbling. "We're stopping for the night," he announced to the farmers, pulling his horse to a halt. "But Paul, we're so close," one of them protested. "We could make it to the next town by sundown." "We're stopping," Paul repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I have to go back." He didn't explain, he couldn't. He just knew he had to ride. He convinced the farmers to wait for him at a defensible spot, promising to return the next day. Then he turned his horse and galloped back the way he had come, pushing the animal harder than he ever had before. He rode through the night, guided by the moon and the frantic beating of his own heart. He arrived in Redemption Gap as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. The town square was packed. In the center stood a newly constructed gallows, a crude and ugly thing, and on the platform, a noose around her neck, stood Esther. She was pale but composed, her hands bound in front of her, her eyes closed in prayer. Caldwell and the sheriff stood nearby, looking smugly triumphant. The crowd was a silent, expectant beast. Time seemed to slow down for Paul. He saw the executioner place a black hood over Esther's head. He saw the sheriff nod. He saw the man's hand reach for the lever. The roar that escaped Paul's throat was not human. It was the sound of pure, primal fury. As he charged into the square, his Colt was already in his hand. The first shot was not aimed at a man, but at the rope. The crack of the pistol echoed off the buildings, and the thick hemp rope, inches from Esther's neck, snapped, the severed end whipping through the air. The crowd gasped, stumbling back in shock and terror. Before anyone could react, Paul was off his horse. The executioner and two deputies moved toward him, but they were too slow. Paul moved like a whirlwind of controlled violence. A pistol whip sent one man sprawling. A brutal kick sent another to his knees. He disarmed the sheriff with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, sending the man's gun skittering across the dust. He leaped onto the gallows, pulling the hood from Esther's head and cutting her bonds with his knife. She stumbled into his arms, trembling, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He held her tight for a second, a silent promise of safety, before turning to face the men who had done this. His eyes, usually so quiet, were now blazing furnaces. He pointed his Colt directly at Caldwell's chest. "You!" Paul snarled, his voice a low, deadly growl. "You did this. You and your pet dogs with badges. You condemned the only decent soul in this entire godforsaken town." Caldwell, for the first time in his life, knew true fear. He held up his hands, his face ashen. "Now, Paul, let's be reasonable. It was the law. The people demanded it." "The law?" Paul laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You are the law in this town, you and your greed. You couldn't stand that she was smarter than you, that she had more courage in her little finger than you have in your whole bloated body, so you fed her to the wolves." His gaze swept over the silent, ashamed faces in the crowd. "And you let him. You let your fear and your ignorance turn you into a lynch mob. She tried to help you. She tried to bring light to this dark place, and you tried to snuff it out." He cocked the hammer of his pistol, the click echoing in the dead silence. Vengeance was a hot, sweet taste in his mouth. He could end it all right here, cleanse the town with blood and fire. But then, a small hand touched his arm. "Paul, no." It was Esther. Her voice was weak but firm. She stood beside him, her eyes pleading. "Do not do this, please." "They tried to kill you, Esther," he said, his voice thick with rage. "I know," she whispered. "But vengeance will not heal what is broken here. It will only create more wounds." She looked into his furious eyes, her own filled with a profound, unwavering faith. Her voice grew stronger as she recited the words they had read together so many times. "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." Her words, spoken with such conviction, were like a bucket of cold water on the fire of his rage. He looked from her earnest face to the pathetic, trembling figure of Caldwell. Killing him now would be an execution, no different from what they had tried to do to her. It would make him no better than them. Slowly, reluctantly, Paul lowered the hammer of his Colt. He did not lower the gun. "You're not worth the bullet," he spat at Caldwell. He then turned to the crowd. "But know this. This gallows will never be used again." He grabbed a lantern from a nearby post, smashed the glass, and tossed the burning wick onto the dry wood of the scaffold. Flames erupted instantly, greedily consuming the symbol of their injustice. As the gallows burned, casting a hellish light on the faces of the townsfolk, Paul lifted Esther into his arms. She was as light as a child. Without another word, he carried her through the stunned crowd, placed her gently on his horse, and mounted behind her. They rode away from Redemption Gap, leaving the fire, the corruption, and the shame behind them. The journey back to his farm was a quiet one. He held her securely against his chest, a silent protector once more. Over the next few days, he nursed her back to health. The color returned to her cheeks, but the horror of what she had endured lingered in her eyes. On his farm, surrounded by the simple honesty of the land, she began to heal. She brought her books, and soon the small farmhouse was filled not with haunting silence, but with the soft rustle of pages and the murmur of her voice as she read aloud to him in the evenings. One evening, a month later, they were sitting on his porch, watching the sunset over the fields he had planted. The air was peaceful, filled with the scent of rich earth and blooming wildflowers. Paul turned to her, his usual stoicism gone, his gray eyes filled with a deep and vulnerable emotion. "Esther," he began, his voice rough, "my life was empty, a house with no one in it. You brought light back into it. You taught me to read, but you also taught me how to feel again." He took her hand, his large, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I don't want to just be your protector anymore. I want to be your partner, your husband." He looked out at the land, his land, which now felt like their land. "I know I don't have much to offer, just this farm, this quiet life, but I swear on my wife's memory, I will spend every day I have left making you happy and keeping you safe." Tears welled in Esther's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She saw before her not a haunted gunslinger, but a good and gentle man who had faced down a whole town for her. A man who had chosen mercy over vengeance because she had asked him to. In his protection, she had found sanctuary. In his quiet strength, she had found love. "Paul," she said, her voice filled with a love that was as strong and true as her faith, "you have already given me everything that matters." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And on that small farm, far from the judgment and cruelty of others, the gunslinger and the scholar, united by respect, loyalty, and a love forged in fire, began to build their life. It was a quiet, peaceful life, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest corners of the West, redemption could be found and a new story could be written.